The steady drum of rain against the windshield had been his only companion for the past 20 minutes. It was just past 9 p.m., and the suburban streets were quieter than usual, with only the occasional car passing by, their headlights creating ghostly reflections on the wet asphalt. He'd stayed late at the office again, finishing up a project that couldn't wait until morning. His mom had already texted twice, asking if he'd remembered to eat dinner. The IT professional adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, thinking about the leftovers waiting in his fridge when something caught his eye. About 50 yards ahead, hazard lights blinked frantically through the rain, a beacon of distress on the shoulder of the road. As he drew closer, he could make out more details. A silver SUV tilted awkwardly to one side, clearly dealing with a flat tire. Through the rain-streaked window, he spotted an elderly woman, probably in her late 60s, huddled under a small umbrella. She was trying to balance her phone in one hand while attempting to make sense of the car's manual in the other. The umbrella wasn't doing much good. Her light-colored cardigan was already soaked at the shoulders. Every few seconds, she would look up and down the road, the worry evident on her face even from a distance. He felt that familiar tug in his chest, the instinct to help wrestling with the reality of the world he lived in. His fingers drummed against the steering wheel as memories flashed through his mind. News headlines, warnings from friends, his mother's constant reminder to stay safe, stay uninvolved. Yet he couldn't shake the image of his own mom in a similar situation, standing alone in the rain, hoping for help that might never come. The woman was struggling with her phone again, probably trying to call for assistance. But out here, between the suburbs and the highway, cell service was spotty at best. He knew this stretch of road well. It would be at least 20 minutes before any professional help could arrive, assuming they could even get through in this weather. More cars whooshed past, their drivers barely slowing down. Each one sent a spray of water onto the shoulder, making the woman flinch and step back. She tried waving at a passing minivan, but its taillights just disappeared into the darkness without hesitation. His grip tightened on the steering wheel. The right thing to do and the safe thing to do weren't always the same. He'd learned that lesson early in life. But sometimes you had to trust your gut, even when experience told you to be cautious. He checked his rearview mirror, no cars coming. The rain had picked up, drumming harder against his car. Through his windshield, he could see the woman had given up on the manual. Now she was just standing there, staring at her phone, shoulders slumped in defeat. She looked so much like his aunt, the one who always brought him extra portions of food during family gatherings, insisting he was too skinny. Making his decision, he eased his foot off the gas. His heartbeat quickened, not from fear, but from the weight of what he was about to do. He'd done this before, helped strangers with car trouble, but each time felt like stepping into unknown territory, a reminder that good intentions weren't always enough to ensure a happy ending. Pulling over about 20 feet ahead of the SUV, he turned on his own hazard lights. In his rearview mirror, he could see the woman looking up, then taking a small step back. He took a deep breath, adjusting his tie, the one his sister had given him for his last birthday. Professional appearance mattered in moments like these. Before opening his door, he sent a quick text to his mom, stopping to help someone with a flat tire. "We'll call you in 30. It was their system, their way of keeping track, of staying safe. He slipped his phone into his pocket, grabbed his umbrella, and reached for the door handle. The rain was coming down harder now, creating a curtain of water between him and the stranded vehicle. As he stepped out into the wet night, his dress shoes immediately soaked through. He could feel the woman's eyes on him, watching, assessing, probably going through the same mental calculations he'd made countless times before. This was the moment of truth. The next few seconds would set the tone for everything that followed. He straightened his shoulders, opened his umbrella, and began walking toward the SUV, each step measured and deliberate. In his mind, he was already running through the steps of changing a tire, hoping the spare would be in good condition. What he didn't know then was that this simple act of kindness, this decision to stop on a rainy night, was about to become much more than just helping someone change a tire. Sometimes the biggest moments in life start with the smallest choices, and this choice, to stop, to help, to care, was about to test everything he believed about human nature, society, and himself. Each step toward the stranded SUV felt heavier than the last. The rain drummed against his umbrella, creating a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. He'd done this mental calculation 100 times before, weighing the risk of stopping against the guilt of driving past. His dad's voice echoed in his head. The world won't always see you for who you are, son. Sometimes they'll only see what they expect to see. The eyed professional adjusted his tie, grateful now for the late meeting that had him still wearing his work clothes. The familiar weight of his employee ID badge still hung from his belt clip, a small detail that might help put the stranded driver at ease. His leather shoes squeaked against the wet pavement, already soaked through from the puddles. As he got closer, he could see more clearly now. The woman was probably someone's grandmother, wearing a beige cardigan that was growing darker with rainwater. She clutched her phone like a lifeline, though its screen was dark. Her free hand nervously twisted a gold wedding band on her finger. The flat tire was obvious now. The right front wheel was completely deflated, probably from hitting one of the countless potholes that plagued this stretch of road. He thought about all the times he'd been in similar situations, the times he'd stopped to help, and the times he'd driven past, the guilt gnawing at him for miles afterward. He remembered the elderly couple whose battery had died at the grocery store parking lot last winter, how their initial wariness had melted into genuine gratitude. But he also remembered the woman who'd hurriedly locked her car doors when he'd simply walked past her at a gas station. His mom's words from breakfast last Sunday rang in his ears. "Baby, I know you've got a good heart, but you've got to be careful out there." She wasn't wrong. He'd seen the news, read the stories, knew how quickly situations like this could go wrong. But he'd also been raised to believe that hiding from the world wasn't the answer. A semi-truck roared past, spraying water across the shoulder. The elderly woman flinched, stepping back from her vehicle, her umbrella offering little protection against the splash. That decided it. He couldn't leave her out here alone, not in this weather, not when he knew he could help. He cleared his throat softly, making sure his footsteps were audible as he approached. No sudden movements, nothing that could be misinterpreted. The woman turned toward him, and he could see the conflicting emotions play across her face. Hope warring with apprehension, need battling against ingrained caution. "Evening, ma'am," he called out, keeping his voice gentle and professional. He stopped a respectful distance away, angling himself so the light from a nearby street lamp fell across his face. "I noticed you're having some trouble with your tire. I'd be happy to help if you'd like." He watched as she took in his appearance, the navy blue suit, though slightly damp now, the polished shoes, the company ID badge. Her grip on the phone loosened slightly, but he could see she was still uncertain. That was okay. He understood. "I'm working it just up the road," he continued, gesturing vaguely toward the office parks in the distance. "I've changed plenty of tires before. This rain isn't going to let up anytime soon, and I wouldn't feel right leaving you out here alone." The woman glanced at her phone again, then back at him. I called for help," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But they said it would be at least an hour, maybe more because of the weather." He nodded sympathetically, maintaining his distance. "That's a long time to wait in this rain. Look," he pulled out his own phone, "I can show you my ID, and you're welcome to take a photo of my license plate. You can even call someone to stay on the phone with you while I change the tire. Whatever would make you feel comfortable." A car drove past slowly, its headlights illuminating them both for a moment. The woman seemed to make up her mind, straightening her shoulders slightly. You really don't mind. It's so late, and the rain." "Not at all," he smiled, keeping his hands visible and his movement slow. "I'd want someone to help my mom if she was stuck out here. Do you know if you have a spare tire?" The next few moments were crucial. He knew that trust, once given, was a delicate thing. His father had taught him that, how a single wrong move, a single misunderstanding, could shatter it instantly. But he'd also taught him that sometimes you had to be the one to take the first step, to show others that their preconceptions could be wrong. As he waited for her response, another memory surfaced, his little sister practicing for her motivational speaking class, her voice filled with conviction. Change happens one person at a time, one moment at a time. Maybe this was one of those moments. Maybe this rainy night was about more than just changing a tire. The woman's shoulders relaxed slightly, and she offered a tentative smile. "Yes, I think so, in the back. My husband always insisted on checking it regularly before he passed last year. He was good about things like that." And just like that, a connection was made. Not a big one, not a dramatic one, but a small bridge of understanding built on shared humanity. He knew the next few minutes would be crucial, not just for changing the tire, but for changing something much more important: perceptions, assumptions, maybe even hearts. The rain had settled into a steady drizzle now, creating a soft background noise that somehow made the night feel more intimate, less threatening. As he walked with the elderly woman toward the back of her SUV, he made sure to keep his movements deliberate and calm. Years of experience had taught him that sometimes the smallest gestures could speak the loudest. "My grandson usually helps me with these things," she said, fumbling with her keys. Her hands were shaking slightly, whether from the cold or nervousness, he couldn't tell. "He's away at college now, first year, engineering major." There was unmistakable pride in her voice, and he seized on that common ground. "Engineering? That's great. I actually studied computer science myself," he replied, keeping his voice warm and conversational. The trunk lock clicked open. "Does he like it so far?" As she talked about her grandson's college adventures, he could feel the initial tension beginning to dissolve. It was amazing how quickly walls could come down when people found shared experiences to connect over. He carefully moved aside some grocery bags and a folded blanket, locating the spare tire compartment. "Oh, those groceries," she sighed. "I was bringing them to the church food drive tomorrow morning. Didn't expect this little adventure on the way home." She wrapped her cardigan tighter around herself, and he noticed she was still getting wet despite her small umbrella. "Ma'am, why don't you sit in your car where it's dry? I can handle this part." He lifted the spare tire out, relieved to see it was in good condition. "Just keep your doors locked if you'd like, and I'll let you know when I need you to release the parking brake." She hesitated for a moment, then nodded gratefully. "You're very kind. You know, I must have seen at least 20 cars pass by before you stopped. People just don't help each other like they used to." As she settled into the driver's seat, he gathered the necessary tools and began setting up the jack. The ground was wet and slightly muddy, but he dealt with worse conditions. His white dress shirt would definitely need dry cleaning after this, but that was a small price to pay. Working methodically, he began loosening the lug nuts on the flat tire. His mind wandered to the Sunday dinners at his aunt's house, where she always told stories about the good old days when neighbors looked out for each other without thinking twice. He wondered if those days had ever really existed, or if people just remembered the past through rose-tinted glasses. Through the car window, he could see the woman on her phone, probably texting someone about her situation. That was smart. It was always good to let others know what was happening. He remembered the text he'd sent to his own mother and made a mental note to call her as soon as this was done. The flat tire was stubborn, probably due to rust around the wheel hub. As he worked, he kept up a running commentary, explaining what he was doing. It helped put people at ease when they understood the process. "Just need to break loose these last 2 lug nuts, then we can jack up the car. Your spare tire's in great shape, by the way. Your husband was right about maintaining it." She rolled down her window slightly to respond, and he could hear the emotion in her voice when she spoke about her late husband. He always said prevention was better than cure. Check the spare every month like clockwork. I tried to keep up with it after he passed, but "You're doing just fine," he assured her, finally getting the last lug nut loose. "A lot of people don't even know where their spare tire is. You've got everything well organized back here." As he worked, more cars passed by, their headlights briefly illuminating the scene. Some slowed down to look, and he could feel their eyes on him, making assumptions, jumping to conclusions. He kept his movements calm and visible, knowing that appearances mattered, especially in situations like this. The woman must have noticed too, because she rolled down her window further. "Would you like some water? I have some bottles in the back seat. You must be tired after working all day." The offer touched him deeply. It was such a simple gesture, but it meant she had moved from seeing him as a potential threat to seeing him as a person who might be thirsty after helping her. These small moments of human connection were what made the risk of stopping worth it. "Thank you, ma'am. Maybe after we get this tire changed." He smiled, then returned to the task at hand. The jack was positioned correctly now, and he began raising the car slowly. "You know, my dad taught me how to change a tire when I was 16. Said it was just as important as learning to drive. Looks like your grandson's grandfather had the same idea." She laughed softly. "Oh yes, he taught all our children, boys and girls both. said you never know when you might need to help someone else. As he worked, they exchanged more stories about family traditions, about how the neighborhood had changed over the years, about the surprising ways people could connect if they just took the time to look past their initial fears. The rain continued its gentle pattern, but it no longer felt like an obstacle. Instead, it had become the backdrop to an unexpected moment of human connection. What neither of them knew was that this peaceful scene was about to change dramatically. In the distance, unseen for now, red and blue lights were beginning to flash, responding to a call from one of those passing cars. But for this moment, in the gentle rain, two strangers were proving that trust and kindness could still bridge the gaps that society sometimes created. The spare tire was almost in place now, and the rain had lightened to a misty drizzle. His dress shirt clung to his back, completely soaked despite his best efforts with the umbrella. But he barely noticed the discomfort anymore, too engaged in the conversation flowing through the partially opened car window. And then my grandson said, "Grandma, that's not how you use a smartphone." The elderly woman's laughter was warm and genuine now, all traces of her earlier fear gone. These young people, they're born knowing this stuff. Is that what you work with in your right job? He tightened another lug nut, smiling at her question. Something like that. I help companies keep their computer systems running smoothly. Not as exciting as it sounds, mostly just making sure everything stays updated and secure. He wiped some rain from his forehead with his sleeve. Actually, my mom still calls me whenever her phone does something unexpected. Last week, she was convinced her phone was broken because the screen wouldn't rotate. "Oh, mine does that sometimes too," she exclaimed, then paused. Was it just that little button at the top needed to be switched?" "Exactly that," he chuckled, moving to the next lug nut. "Took me 20 minutes to convince her to check it. Parents and technology, right?" A comfortable silence fell between them as he finished securing the spare tire. The passing cars had become less frequent now, but each one that slowed down still sent a small spike of anxiety through him. He'd learned to keep working steadily, his movements purposeful and clear. The woman seemed to sense his unease, because she spoke up louder whenever a car passed, making sure anyone watching could see this was a welcome interaction. "My husband would have loved to meet you," she said softly, after a particularly slow-moving car finally passed. "He always said you can tell a person's character by how they treat strangers in need." She paused, then added with a touch of sadness, "He used to stop and help people too, you know, right up until his health wouldn't let him anymore." He stood up, dusting off his soaked dress pants. "He sounds like a wise man. My father's the same way. Always taught us that karma comes back around. Help others when you can, because someday you might be the one needing help." As he packed the flat tire and tools back into the trunk, the woman insisted on helping despite his protests. She held his umbrella over them both, telling him about her husband's career as a high school teacher. 42 years teaching chemistry. He loved showing kids how the world worked, especially the ones who thought science wasn't for them. "Chemistry was actually my worst subject," he admitted, closing the trunk carefully. "But I had this amazing tutor in high school who helped me through it. Sometimes one person believing in you makes all the difference." The woman nodded knowingly. "That's what my husband always said. She stopped suddenly, her eyes focusing on something behind him. The umbrella in her hand trembled slightly. He didn't need to turn around to know what she'd seen. The reflection of flashing lights had already painted the wet pavement in alternating red and blue. His heart sank, but he kept his movements slow and deliberate as he turned to face what he knew was coming. 2 police cruisers had pulled up, their headlights creating harsh shadows across the scene. He could hear car doors opening, the crackle of a radio, the sound of boots on wet pavement. His mind raced through all the things his parents had taught him about these situations. Keep your hands visible, move slowly, stay calm. The elderly woman was already stepping forward, her voice rising with an emotion he hadn't heard from her before. Was it anger? Indignation? "Officers, this young man is helping me change my tire. He's been nothing but..." But the approaching footsteps didn't slow. The familiar commands were already ringing out through the rainy night. "Step away from the vehicle. Hands where we can see them." In that moment, standing in the rain with his hands slowly rising, he caught the woman's eye. The look they shared spoke volumes, her horror at the situation, his resigned acceptance of it, and underneath it all, a mutual understanding that this moment was bigger than just them. It was about all the assumptions, fears, and prejudices that had brought them to this point. The flashing lights painted everything in surreal colors, but he focused on keeping his breathing steady. The good work was already done. The tire was changed, a connection was made, trust was built. Whatever happened next couldn't take away the fact that two strangers had chosen to see the best in each other on a rainy night. Sometimes, he thought, that's where real change begins. The spare tire was almost in place now, and the rain had lightened to a misty drizzle. His dress shirt clung to his back, completely soaked despite his best efforts with the umbrella. But he barely noticed the discomfort anymore, too engaged in the conversation flowing through the partially opened car window. And then my grandson said, "Grandma, that's not how you use a smartphone." The elderly woman's laughter was warm and genuine now, all traces of her earlier fear gone. These young people, they're born knowing this stuff. Is that what you work with in your right job? He tightened another lug nut, smiling at her question. Something like that. I help companies keep their computer systems running smoothly. Not as exciting as it sounds, mostly just making sure everything stays updated and secure. He wiped some rain from his forehead with his sleeve. Actually, my mom still calls me whenever her phone does something unexpected. Last week, she was convinced her phone was broken because the screen wouldn't rotate. "Oh, mine does that sometimes too," she exclaimed, then paused. Was it just that little button at the top needed to be switched? Exactly that, he chuckled, moving to the next lug nut. Took me 20 minutes to convince her to check it. Parents and technology, right? A comfortable silence fell between them as he finished securing the spare tire. The passing cars had become less frequent now, but each one that slowed down still sent a small spike of anxiety through him. He'd learned to keep working steadily, his movements purposeful and clear. The woman seemed to sense his unease, because she spoke up louder whenever a car passed, making sure anyone watching could see this was a welcome interaction. "My husband would have loved to meet you," she said softly, after a particularly slow-moving car finally passed. "He always said you can tell a person's character by how they treat strangers in need." She paused, then added with a touch of sadness, "He used to stop and help people too, you know, right up until his health wouldn't let him anymore." He stood up, dusting off his soaked dress pants. "He sounds like a wise man. My father's the same way. Always taught us that karma comes back around. Help others when you can, because someday you might be the one needing help." As he packed the flat tire and tools back into the trunk, the woman insisted on helping despite his protests. She held his umbrella over them both, telling him about her husband's career as a high school teacher. 42 years teaching chemistry. He loved showing kids how the world worked, especially the ones who thought science wasn't for them. "Chemistry was actually my worst subject," he admitted, closing the trunk carefully. "But I had this amazing tutor in high school who helped me through it. Sometimes one person believing in you makes all the difference." The woman nodded knowingly. "That's what my husband always said. She stopped suddenly, her eyes focusing on something behind him. The umbrella in her hand trembled slightly. He didn't need to turn around to know what she'd seen. The reflection of flashing lights had already painted the wet pavement in alternating red and blue. His heart sank, but he kept his movements slow and deliberate as he turned to face what he knew was coming. 2 police cruisers had pulled up, their headlights creating harsh shadows across the scene. He could hear car doors opening, the crackle of a radio, the sound of boots on wet pavement. His mind raced through all the things his parents had taught him about these situations. Keep your hands visible, move slowly, stay calm. The elderly woman was already stepping forward, her voice rising with an emotion he hadn't heard from her before. Was it anger? Indignation? "Officers, this young man is helping me change my tire. He's been nothing but..." But the approaching footsteps didn't slow. The familiar commands were already ringing out through the rainy night. "Step away from the vehicle. Hands where we can see them." In that moment, standing in the rain with his hands slowly rising, he caught the woman's eye. The look they shared spoke volumes, her horror at the situation, his resigned acceptance of it, and underneath it all, a mutual understanding that this moment was bigger than just them. It was about all the assumptions, fears, and prejudices that had brought them to this point. The flashing lights painted everything in surreal colors, but he focused on keeping his breathing steady. The good work was already done. The tire was changed, a connection was made, trust was built. Whatever happened next couldn't take away the fact that two strangers had chosen to see the best in each other on a rainy night. Sometimes, he thought, that's where real change begins. The red and blue lights transformed the quiet roadside scene into something else entirely. Rain droplets caught the spinning lights, creating an almost dreamlike effect, but there was nothing dreamy about the rapid sequence of events unfolding. The eyed professional kept his hands raised, clearly visible in the harsh glare of the police cruiser's headlights. His heart pounded, but his face remained calm. This was a scenario he'd mentally rehearsed countless times. Step away from the vehicle. Hands where we can see them. The commands came again, more forceful this time. Two officers approached, their hands hovering near their weapons. Behind them, a third officer moved to flank the scene, his flashlight beam cutting through the misty rain. The elderly woman stepped forward, her voice rising above the sound of idling engines and radio static. "What are you doing?" "This young man is helping me. He's changing my tire." The umbrella she'd been holding clattered to the ground, forgotten in her distress. "Ma'am, please step back toward your vehicle," one of the officers instructed, his tone leaving no room for argument. But the woman didn't move. Instead, she planted herself firmly between the officers and the man who'd stopped to help her. "I will not step back," she declared, her voice trembling not with fear, but with indignation. "This is absolutely ridiculous. He's wearing a business suit, for heaven's sake. He has his company ID badge right there. He's been nothing but kind and professional, helping me when dozens of other cars just drove past." The eyed professional kept his movements slow and controlled as he spoke. "Officers, I understand the situation. I'm just helping this lady change her flat tire. My ID is on my belt, and my car is parked right there." His voice was steady, professional, the same voice he used in corporate meetings. "Would you like me to show you my identification?" One of the officers moved closer, his flashlight beam scanning over the scene, the changed tire, the tools laid out neatly on the ground, the grocery bags visible through the SUV's back window. The elderly woman continued her passionate defense. "Do you want to see my phone? I took a picture of his license plate before he started helping. He suggested it himself. He's been telling me about his job, about his mother who calls him for tech support. He's been nothing but respectful and kind. This is shameful." The lead officer's stance shifted slightly, though his hand remained near his weapon. "We received a call about a suspicious person by a vehicle on this road. We have to investigate all calls, ma'am." "Suspicious?" The woman's voice rose higher, decades of schoolteacher authority ringing in her tone. "The only suspicious thing here is why someone would call the police on a Good Samaritan. I've lived in this community for 40 years, and I've never been so embarrassed by it." Rain continued to fall, soaking through the eyed professional's already wet clothes, but he remained still, hands visible, face composed. He'd been here before, maybe not this exact situation, but close enough. His father's words echoed in his mind. Stay calm, stay dignified, let the truth speak for itself. The third officer had made his way to the eyed professional's parked car, shining his flashlight through the windows. "Car's clean," he called out. "Business parking permit on the dashboard. Looks like he works at the tech park up the road." The elderly woman seized on this information. "Of course he does. That's what he told me when he first offered to help. He showed me his ID, explained everything. He even waited for me to feel comfortable before starting to help. And this is how we repay kindness in our community." Something in her voice, perhaps the mixture of disappointment and anger, or maybe the way she positioned herself protectively, seemed to finally shift the atmosphere. The lead officer's posture relaxed slightly, though his professional demeanor remained. "Sir, can you slowly reach for your ID and show it to me?" "Yes, officer." I'm going to move my right hand to my belt clip very slowly. Each movement was telegraphed, deliberate. The company ID badge, when presented, showed exactly what he'd said. A night professional at a well-known tech company, complete with security clearance markers. The elderly woman wasn't finished. "Look at his clothes, his car, his manner. He stopped to help me in the rain, ruining his suit in the process. He's been explaining everything he's doing, making sure I feel safe." And someone, Her voice cracked slightly. Someone saw this kindness and assumed the worst. What does that say about us? Her words hung in the rain-filled air, heavy with meaning. The officers exchanged glances, their tactical approach softening as the reality of the situation became clear. The lead officer lowered his hand from his weapon, though his face remained professional, giving nothing away. The eyed professional kept his voice level, despite the adrenaline still coursing through his system. Officers, the spare tire is on now. I just need to make sure it's properly secured. Would you like to supervise while I finish? This simple, practical suggestion seemed to provide everyone a way forward. The lead officer nodded, while the elderly woman finally retrieved her fallen umbrella, holding it over both herself and the eyed professional as he knelt to check the lug nuts one final time. The scene had transformed again, the harsh confrontation softening into something more complex, more human. But the red and blue lights kept flashing, a reminder that this moment, like so many others, would leave its mark on everyone involved. The tension in the air began to dissolve like the now softening rain, but its effects lingered like the puddles on the asphalt. The lead officer had stepped back, his stance more relaxed though still professional. His flashlight beam moved from the newly changed tire to the tools arranged neatly on the ground, then to the eyed professional's soaked business suit. Everything appears to be in order here, the officer stated, his tone shifted from command to conversation. Sir, do you need any assistance completing the tire change? The eyed professional shook his head slightly, his hands now lowered but movements still deliberate. No, thank you, officer. I just need about 2 more minutes to ensure all the lug nuts are properly tightened. Safety first. His voice remained steady, professional, though his heart was still racing beneath his rain-soaked shirt. The elderly woman hadn't moved from her protective stance, her umbrella now sheltering both herself and the man who'd stopped to help her. Her voice, when she spoke again, carried years of wisdom and barely contained emotion. You know, my late husband taught high school for 4 decades. He always said you can tell everything about a community by how it treats people who stop to help others. The second officer had wandered over to examine the flat tire, his flashlight revealing the deep gash in the rubber. Looks like you hit one of those potholes near the construction zone, he commented, his voice carrying a hint of sympathy. We've had 3 calls about flat tires in this area this week alone. The eyed professional nodded as he worked, tightening the final lug nuts. Yes, ma'am, that's what I figured too. The road's pretty rough through here. He kept his focus on the task, though he was acutely aware of every movement around him. Years of experience had taught him that the end of these situations could be just as delicate as the beginning. The elderly woman was not quite finished making her point. When my husband was alive, this sort of thing, helping strangers, it was just what neighbors did. No one called the police because someone stopped to help change a tire. She adjusted her grip on the umbrella, making sure the eyed professional stayed dry as he worked. I'd like to know who made that call. I'd like to ask them what exactly they found suspicious about basic human kindness. The lead officer cleared his throat. Ma'am, we have to respond to all calls we receive, but I can see this was clearly a misunderstanding. He paused, then added with a hint of genuine respect, You're fortunate this gentleman stopped to help. Not many people would, especially in this weather. That's exactly my point, she replied, her voice softening slightly. Not many would stop, but he did. And this is how we thank him. By assuming the worst. She shook her head, decades of disappointment evident in her gesture. What message does that send to people who want to help others? The eyed professional stood up, wiping his hands on his already ruined dress pants. All done, ma'am. The spare is secure now. His voice remained professional, but carried a warmth that hadn't been diminished by the evening's events. You'll want to get that flat tire replaced as soon as possible. The spare isn't meant for long-term use. The third officer, who had been radioing into dispatch, approached with a slightly apologetic expression. Sir, we appreciate your cooperation. And ma'am, thank you for clarifying the situation. He glanced at his fellow officers before adding, We're sorry for any distress this caused. We have to treat all calls seriously, but we can see now that this was, he searched for the right words, an unnecessary concern. The elderly woman's expression softened slightly, but her voice remained firm. Well, I certainly hope you'll note in your report that this young man was performing an act of kindness. that he stopped to help when dozens of others drove by, that he was professional, courteous, and made sure I felt safe the entire time. The lead officer nodded, pulling out his notepad. "Yes, ma'am. We'll make sure that's all documented." He turned to the IT professional. "Sir, you're free to go whenever you're finished here. Do you need anything from us?" The IT professional shook his head, a small smile finally breaking through his careful composure. "No, thank you, officer. I just want to make sure this lady gets safely on her way." He turned to the elderly woman. "Would you like me to follow you to the nearest gas station, just to make sure the spare holds up?" The woman's eyes welled with tears, though her voice remained strong. "Such a gentleman, just like I told these officers. But no, dear, you've done more than enough. More than enough." She reached out and briefly touched his arm, a gesture of gratitude that spoke volumes. "I'll call my grandson to meet me at the gas station. He needs to learn there are still good people in this world, people who'll stop to help a stranger on a rainy night." As the police cruisers began to pull away, their lights still casting occasional flashes across the wet pavement, the IT professional gathered his tools. The rain had almost stopped now, leaving behind a clean, washed feeling in the air. But something else had been washed clean too, not the systemic problems that had led to this situation, perhaps, but at least one small corner of understanding had been reached, one small bridge had been built. 2 weeks later, the IT professional sat at his desk, sipping his morning coffee and scrolling through his emails. The incident on that rainy night might have faded into memory like so many others, but fate had different plans. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "Have you seen the local paper? Page 3. He pulled up the local news website on his computer, and there it was, a letter to the editor that made him pause mid-sip. The elderly woman had written about that night, not just about the flat tire or the police response, but about something bigger. She wrote about community, about assumptions, about the choice to help or drive by. His office phone rang. It was his supervisor. "Hey, you might want to come down to the lobby. There's someone here to see you." The cryptic message made him curious. As he rode the elevator down, straightening his tie, a new one, since the rain had ruined his old favorite, he wondered what to expect. The lobby doors opened to reveal the elderly woman from that rainy night, but she wasn't alone. With her stood her grandson, home from college for the weekend, and 3 other elderly ladies who she introduced as her church committee. They carried a basket of homemade cookies and a card signed by her entire congregation. "I hope you don't mind us dropping by," she said, her eyes twinkling with the same spirit that had faced down police officers 2 weeks ago. "But after my letter was published, so many people wanted to meet the young man who restored their faith in humanity." Her grandson stepped forward, hand extended. "My grandma told me everything that happened. I'm studying engineering, but I'm also part of a campus organization that works on community relations. Would you be interested in speaking to our group about your experience?" The IT professional accepted a cookie, touched by the gesture, but also aware of the deeper meaning behind this visit. His mother had always told him that one act of kindness could ripple out in unexpected ways. Now he was seeing it happen in real time. That evening, he sat in his living room with his parents, sharing the cookies and the story. His father's eyes grew misty as he read the newspaper article. "You know," his dad said quietly, "when I was your age, something similar happened to me. But back then, there was no one to speak up, no one to write letters to the editor." His mother squeezed his hand. "Things are changing, slowly but surely. Your story is making people think, making them question their assumptions." Over the next few months, the ripples continued to spread. The elderly woman's letter sparked a series of community discussions about prejudice and perception. The local police department implemented new training protocols for responding to calls that might be based on bias. The IT professional found himself invited to speak at community centers and schools, sharing his experience not with anger or resentment, but with hope for change. The construction company finally fixed the pothole that had caused the flat tire after the elderly woman's persistent letters to city council. She joked that she'd found her new calling. Community activism wasn't that different from being a grandmother after all. Both required patience, persistence, and lots of baked goods. Her grandson's college organization started a program pairing students with elderly residents for basic car maintenance lessons, combining practical skills with community building. The IT professional occasionally volunteered, teaching both tire-changing techniques and the importance of looking beyond appearances. One rainy evening, almost 6 months after the incident, he found himself driving down the same stretch of road. A car was pulled over, hazard lights blinking. This time, when he stopped to help, 3 other cars stopped too. As they all worked together, a nurse coming off a shift, a high school teacher heading home, and a delivery driver making his last run, he smiled, remembering the elderly woman's words about how you can tell everything about a community by how it treats people who stop to help others. His phone buzzed. It was a text from the elderly woman who had somehow become a regular part of his life, sending him her latest letter to the editor. This one was about the power of small actions, about how changing a tire on a rainy night had somehow helped change minds and hearts too. As he drove home later, the stars finally visible after another rainy day, he thought about all the ways that night had transformed not just his life, but his community. His father had been right. Karma does come back around. Sometimes it comes back with homemade cookies, sometimes with community meetings, and sometimes with the simple sight of multiple cars stopping to help a stranger in need. The local diner, where he now had a standing breakfast date with the elderly woman every other Sunday, had become a sort of unofficial headquarters for their growing movement of community change. Over pancakes and coffee, they planned events, shared stories, and reminded each other that progress often starts in the smallest of ways, even with a flat tire on a rainy night. His mother had framed the newspaper article, hanging it in their family room next to his college diploma. This, she would tell visitors, is what real education looks like. This is how we learn to be better humans. And so, what could have been just another tense encounter, just another story of suspicion and prejudice, had somehow transformed into something else entirely, a testament to the power of speaking up, standing firm, and choosing to see the best in others, even on the darkest, rainiest nights.